There's a story that I heard from a scholar who studied Nicholas Bobadilla, that talks about Bobadilla at the end of his life. He's the last of the first companions to die, and so he's the last link to this founding moment of the history of the Society of Jesus. And apparently, there was a novitiate nearby where he lived when he was dying, and the novice master got the pious idea that he would bring the novices into the bed chamber of Nicholas Bobadilla on his deathbed, so that Bobadilla could share with these novices a little bit of the stories of the founding of the Society of Jesus and what Ignatius was like. So he ushers these novices into the room with Father Bobadilla. And he says, well, Father Bobadilla, would you like to tell us about what it was like and tell us the stories of founding the Society of Jesus? And as the story goes, Bobadilla lets out a profound and lengthy sigh, and he says, this is not the Society of Jesus that we intended to found. Full stop. And after having made this rather shocking statement, apparently the novice master said, I think we need to give Father Bobadilla some time to get his rest. And he ushered the novices out, realizing that perhaps this was not going to be the sort of edifying conversation that he had hoped with Father Bobadilla. This question of what the society was supposed to be, what the society, how the society came to take the form that it took, is a good question for us to consider as, again, we continue to explore what our way of proceeding is as the Jesuits and how discernment informs the kind of ministries that we do and who we are. Today, I want to look at how the society discerned its first missions. And in particular, I want to look at how consolation informed the discernment of the society in its first missions. And for that, I want to look particularly at the third rule of the first week of these spiritual exercises, where it says, by this kind of consolation, I mean that which occurs when some interior motion is caused within the soul, through which it becomes inflamed with love of its Creator and Lord. As a result, it can love no created thing on the face of the earth in itself, but only in the Creator of them all. Similarly, this consolation experience is experienced when the soul sheds tears which move it to love for its Lord, whether they are tears of grief for its own sins or about the passion of Christ our Lord, or about other matters directly ordered to his service and praise. Finally, under the word consolation, I include every increase in hope, faith, and charity, and every interior joy which calls and attracts one towards heavenly things and to the salvation of one's soul by bringing it tranquility and peace in its Creator and Lord. Consolation, things that inflame us with love for God, that move us to tears, that move us towards a virtuous life. Consolation is this primary language of how God speaks to us, as Ignatius presents it. And what I want to look at today is what consolation did for how the society decided to move forward in its earliest days. Because the thing about the society in its earliest days is we didn't have a ministry that we were going to do. We were going to do whatever ministries were going to be where the need was greatest. We weren't going to be a teaching order, or we weren't just going to be a missionary order. We were going to go to the places where we were needed most, where it was hardest for people to go, and we were going to figure out what to do there and how to proclaim God's ministry there. And to do that, we needed to follow the consolation that we felt. We needed to follow the invitation of God that he gives us when he consoles us in our prayer. So in order to talk about this, I want to talk a little bit about the mission, some of the earliest missions. And first, I want to talk a little bit about some of the earliest missions of the first companions. Pierre Fabre is a great example of this. Now, one of the things that again, when I keep on talking about discernment as being related to our mission, but you might be saying to yourself, well, but Thomas, don't we do our missions under obedience. And that's absolutely true. Obedience is very important. And it's worth talking about. And in a later lecture, I will talk about the connection between discernment and obedience. But the thing is, even when we are engaged in a mission under obedience, there is a lot to discern. There is a lot of where we need to pay attention to where the consolation is, because we need to determine how to do the mission that we're given. And there's no greater example of this among the early companions of Père Favre, because Favre was constantly being sent by the Pope and by other dignitaries in the church and in the secular society on important missions. He was constantly being whisked away from the things that he was doing and the fruitful ministry he was engaged in to go to some place of great controversy. He was called, for example, to the colloquy of Worms, which was this great colloquy between that the Holy Roman Emperor arranged between Catholic theologians and Lutheran theologians. And Favre is constantly being put in the mix of all these sort of things. But the colloquy of Worms that he's called to in the early 1540s is a great example of where discernment becomes really important, because he's sent there. So he has to travel there from Italy. He goes to the colloquy of Worms. And when he gets there, he's told, oh, we don't want you to talk in the colloquy. We don't want you to be involved in the colloquy. We have theologians for that. We've already decided you're not involved in that. Okay, so he's not supposed to be involved. So he figures, well, I'll talk to Protestants while I'm there, and I'll engage with them personally in spiritual conversation and see if I can make some fruit toward reconciling to the church. And he's like, no, that would upset the delicacy of the balance. So no, Father Favre, you are not going to talk to any Protestants. But they wanted him to be there, even though they basically had nothing for him to do. So Favre started in Worms doing what actually Favre did everywhere that he went. This is what I like to call the Favrean method of ministry. And the Favrean method of ministry is rooted in where Favre found the most fruit, is rooted in Favre's discernment of, okay, wherever I am, this is what gives me consolation. This is where God invites me to serve. No matter what the specifics of my mission are, this way of ministering is a way that I can always do good. What's the way? Preaching, confession, and the exercises as a methodology. What do I mean by that? A methodology of deepening conversion. What Favre would do everywhere that he went, and all the various cities he was sent to over the very short 5 or 6 years in which between 1540 and his death in 1546, what he would do is he would get invitations to preach. Preaching this time, we're not talking about preaching at Mass. We're talking about preaching in the afternoon on a Sunday or a feast day. We're talking about an hour to 3 hours of preaching. This is a very typical way of preaching. And Favre would preach on morality. Favre would preach in general on the 10 Commandments. And what was he doing there? Well, he was trying to get people to re-examine their lives, to really consider if they were living true Christian lives, if they were really living up to the faith that they profess, or at least the faith into which they were baptized. So he would get, through this preaching, he would get them to examine their conscience and to consider whether they were really being faithful to their call as Christians. This would lead to step 2 in his methodology, because, of course, having done that, certain people would leave his sermons with the desire to go to confession. So Favre was always available to hear confessions. He was, in fact, a great confessor, because he heard confessions. He celebrated that sacrament in a way that was very different from what was normative in this period. Because in this period, confession was very much the realm of canon law. That is to say, it was very much a judicial process by which all the books that counseled you to how to be a confessor in the 16th century were telling you how to investigate to make sure that the person was properly contrite, to make sure that you know the gravity of the sin, and to make sure that the person has confessed everything that they need to confess. And so you're judging and then absolving. But what isn't in any of the books about how to confess in the 16th century is how to help the person, how to counsel the person. Now, of course, absolution helps the person. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to absolve. Of course, it's central to what we're doing in confession. But Favre thought, hey, I'd like to not just help these people by absolving them. I'd like to help them not to sin. I'd like to help them to lead a more virtuous life. And so he had a very much more pastoral, much more spiritual direction driven model of how to hear confessions. My favorite thing that he ever wrote about confessions is in a letter that he wrote to a fellow Jesuit, Cornelius Wischhaven, in which he said, among other things, "The Holy Spirit will be given to you in the hearing of confessions if you are gentle and mild, keeping yourselves in a spirit of forbearance and not allowing yourself to be touched by an attitude of harshness or disgust that might possibly be occasioned by a penitent's crudeness. We must be on our guard, lest we acquire a loathing for so important and holy a work. We are in the place of Christ who bears the sins of the world. We must beware lest any sinner suffer chagrin in his approach to the representatives of the gentle Christ. Let us avoid pharisaical sternness and that legalism that irritates to no end. Let us send away no one who would not gladly return to us." Let us send away no one who would not gladly return to us. Favre preaches on the Ten Commandments to get people to kind of begin a conversion. Then he invites them to confession and he gives them spiritual direction. He gives them in confessions ways not just to understand why they sin, ways for them to be encouraged to sin no more, ways for them to methodology about how to turn away from sin and how to lead a more virtuous life. And of course, in this, he's learning who is the most open to a further process of conversion. And so to some who have come to him for confession, he invites to make spiritual exercises, whether just the first week or in their totality, depending on the case. This is how Favre discerned within his missions. He was where he was because he had been ordered, usually by the Pope, to be there. But he found consolation, even in a frustrating situation, by doing this, by doing what gave him the deepest consolation, which was accompanying people in their spiritual life, in their process of conversion more and more to Christ. We can look at another example of the early companions in Nicolas Bobadilla. Now, of course, Bobadilla is sort of legendary among us as Jesuits, and we have a tendency to say very harsh things about him because he seems to have struggled with obedience. And we will hear some, along the course of his life, there's definitely some questionable things. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about his ministry. What he was really good at was reconciling people in a couple of different ways. Number one, in 1538, the Pope sent him to reconcile Juana of Aragon with her husband, Ascansancio Colonna. He literally was sent to patch back together a marriage. He was sent to help this couple reconcile to each other, which is something to remember when you think of all the negative things or that you think about Bobadilla. It's important to remember that this was a ministry he was good at, reconciling people. The other place he was good at reconciling people was reconciling people to God. He had a real knack and was in demand all over Southern Europe, in particular Southern Europe, for the reform of monasteries that had fallen away from the observance of their rule. He would go into a monastery of men or women, and he would help them kind of rediscover their spiritual lives, rediscover prayer, rediscover the goodness of their own discipline, of their own rule. And this is all very much to his credit. And again, it's a way that he followed the things that he was good at, because the things we're good at are important in how we discern, because God calls to us, gives us consolation in the places where we find great fruit. And so this is important in discernment of ministry. Now, of course, the difficulty with Bobadilla, of course, is that he tended to be often in the company of the rich and the powerful. And this is where some of his negative attributes come out. For example, he writing from his from a place at a court at the royal court of Ferdinand I, he says back to writing back to Rome, he says, "I have been to converse with His Majesty Ferdinand I 2 or 3 times, and we have arranged together for longer talks. To his great satisfaction and joy, and that of his entire court, I have taken room at a hospital. Not that Signor Nuncio would not have given me the best room in his house, indeed the whole of his house, but because the hospital is near a church and the palace, and I shall thus be able to converse with everybody and work more conveniently. Their serene majesties, the king and queen, show me great favor in public and in private by the grace of Christ." We start to see in this the way that Bobadilla likes attention, the way that Bobadilla likes the honors that he's given, the way that Bobadilla likes the fact that it pleases the emperor Ferdinand I, the way that he's saying how pleasing the way that he serves is to the emperor. He is somebody at the beginning of his own little kind of spiritual autobiography. He lists how many bishops he's met over the course of his life. We see in Bobadilla that one of the difficulties of Jesuit life and the great latitude we have to discern is that it is easy to confuse our own enjoyment for the spiritual consolation that God gives us. Bobadilla sometimes seems, at least to most of us, at least to me, that he is more following what is pleasing to him and what gives him comfort rather than what gives him consolation. And that's an important thing that we need to consider when we consider how God calls us to discern. We cannot confuse these two things. We need to consider, is the consolation that I'm giving really coming from God? And how do I know that? Well, one of the ways that we know that is by the fruitfulness of what we are doing. Not, is it pleasing to the monarch, but is it helping the monarch? Am I actually helping someone to grow in virtue? Am I actually helping people to grow closer to God? These are important questions that we ask. The third of the first companions that I want to mention is Francis Xavier. And Francis Xavier, we know the story of Francis Xavier. I'm not going to belabor the point on talking about Francis Xavier's missions. However, one of the things that I want to talk about in regard to Francis Xavier is the fact that his ministry is a ministry of constant discernment, because he is going where there is no missionary map, where he does not know how to proceed, and he does not have the luxury of an easy communication with his superiors, because it takes so long for messages, for letters to travel back and forth from India or Japan to Rome. As a consequence, Xavier is constantly caught in the situation where he has to decide for himself where the greatest fruit is. He has to decide, he has to negotiate Portuguese politics and the ways that the Portuguese are often more interested in exploiting India and other places in Asia rather than the conversion that he's there for. But he also works for the Portuguese, and he is a Portuguese kind of ambassador. He has this sort of political aspect to his job. And so he needs to keep them happy so that he can do what he's doing, but he's not interested in the same things that they are interested in. And in fact, one of the reasons he's so late in finally getting to China is specifically because Portuguese politics, and it's a long story I won't tell here, but Portuguese politics prevent him several times from getting to China, because there's an argument among different people about precedents and other things like that, and who he's traveling with versus who he should be traveling with, and all these sorts of things. And so Xavier's has the constant need in his work to discern, how can I really do what I'm doing in the face of all these difficulties? And then, of course, we have things like this. A line from Xavier about his ministry among the pagan people of India, where he says, "Whenever I hear of an act of idolatrous worship, I go to the place with a large band of children who very soon load the devil with a greater amount of insult and abuse than he has lately received received of honor and worship from their parents, relations and acquaintances. The children run at the idols, upset them, dash them down, break them to pieces, spit on them, trample on them, kick them about, and in short, heap on them every possible outrage. Now, I read this because this is a great example of interreligious dialogue. No, this is a terrible example of interreligious dialogue. It's something that, of course, disturbs us, rightly so. This is not the way that we engage in interreligious dialogue. It is not a respectful way. It's not, we can excuse the past, but that's not my goal. My goal is not to excuse Xavier. This was not a good way, even in his day, of doing what he was doing. The question, of course, is, well, how does he come to this discernment? How does he make this discernment? Where's the consolation and where's the desolation in this? Well, of course, what we see in this is Xavier's zeal. What we see in this is Xavier's zeal. Xavier is convinced of Christ, of the truth of our faith. And he is convinced that these things that the traditional religious practices he is encountering are wicked, that they're actually not just, they're not neutral or somewhat good or not the fullness of good. They are actually leading people astray. That's his perspective. I'm not saying that's our perspective. Certainly it isn't, but that's his perspective. And so his perspective is that this needs to be extirpated. Now, that's not necessarily the right way to look at these things, but the important thing that we need to consider is, what's the motivation? His problem is not his zeal. His problem is his knowledge. So if in Bobadilla we see that the problem is confusing our pleasure with our consolation, in Xavier what we see is that in order to really understand where God is calling us, we have to know. We have to know things. Our intellect is important. And what was lacking for Xavier, when in the places where we cringe at the way that he ministered, was not his prayer, was not his connection to God, was not his zeal for the faith. All those are wonderful things for which we rightly still admire him today, and we rightly are proud of all of the good that he did in his ministry. What was lacking was his knowledge of these practices. What was lacking was his patience to learn about these practices and to look for the good in what they were, so that he could have done this with greater gentleness and perhaps reaped even greater fruit. And so when we think about consolation, we need to consider false consolations, our comforts, but we also need to consider that we can be misled in our discernments by our own lack of knowledge, by our own misunderstanding of the situation. And, God's not going to give us just magically knowledge. We need to gain the knowledge and then bring that to prayer, because our lack of knowledge can be our blind spot in the way that we discern. I want to talk about one final discernment. I want to talk about the discernment to found the first Jesuit college explicitly for lay people, which happened in Messina in 1548. The first independent boys' school opened by the society. We had some colleges before where we had some lay students, but this is one that we founded in order to have lay students. This is how the society got into running colleges. Now, how the society got into education is another story, because how we got into education is in the form of the Institute. Teaching catechism to the unlettered and to youth is part of who we are as Jesuits. That's been there from the beginning, that we've always thought, one of the ways that we draw people closer to God is by increasing their knowledge of God. The knowledge, again, is important in our ministry. But the question of why did we start running schools is another question. Sometimes this is presented as a dramatic change in the society's kind of nature, a dramatic change in who we are as Jesuits, because we suddenly became a teaching order or a schools order. I don't think of it as a dramatic change, but I think of it as an important moment. It's an important moment because today, as we look at the society, we are known for education, and we have a ton of educational institutions all over the world. And we are questioning today, as we look around the world, can we sustain all of the institutional commitments we have made to colleges? To schools, excuse me. We see the good that we do through schools, but we look at some of our schools don't seem as Jesuit or even as Catholic as we want them to be. Some of our schools, we just don't have any Jesuits there at all. And we wonder, well, can they be Jesuit without us? Some of our schools don't seem to fulfill our mission in the way that we want them to. And we ask, do we have ordered attachments to our schools? Are our schools the place where we should be? But it's hard to get rid of them because they seem part and parcel to our identity. And what I want to suggest is that the schools are no different than Bobadilla's ministry in the Reformation of monasteries, Xavier's ministry in India, or Favre's ministry in the confessional and in the exercises. They are all of these things are means to our end. What's our end? To serve where the need is greatest, to help greatest, to help souls. All of these things are means. They are not in themselves ends. What we need to ask in order to be free in our discernment of where we should be in relation to our educational institutions today is, where's the consolation? And I think, where is the voice of God? Where is God calling us right now in terms of our ministry of education, which is a non-negotiable because it's in the formula of the Institute. But what way are we going to manifest ourselves as those who educate? And I think Messina and the consolation that drove that discernment is a wonderful touch point, a wonderful piece of knowledge that can help us in our discernment so that we don't fall in to just being comfortable in staying on our institutions. So we don't fall into the error of Bobadilla in confusing comfort with consolation, and we don't fall into the error of Xavier in not having enough knowledge, but rather we stay true to the consolation that drives us forward in serving God and serving where the need is greatest. So here's what I want to say about the founding of the College of Messina. There's a lot that I could say about it. It's something I've written about, and I could talk for a long time, but I just want to make a very simple point. Juan de Vega was the viceroy of Sicily for the Habsburgs. We knew Juan de Vega the Jesuits knew Juan de Vega before he got to Sicily, because he had been the ambassador of the Holy Roman Emperor in Rome, and we had a lot to deal with him there. He asked for Jesuits to come with him when he was appointed viceroy of Sicily. Ignatius sent 2 Jesuits at different points, second of whom was a man named Hieronymo Dominic. And Hieronymo Dominic got in conversation with Juan de Vega and his wife, Eleonora de Azorio, about this idea of the Jesuits founding a school for lay people in Messina. Eventually, this conversation started to be a conversation between Dominic and Ignatius, and then Ignatius and Juan de Vega, and then the civic leaders, the magistrates in Messina, write to Ignatius, and they're saying, could you found a school? Why did Ignatius want to do this? Why did he want to found a school? Well, the first reason he wanted to do it was because there seemed to be a need. In Sicily, they didn't have schools like this, and Dominic's writing to him, he says all this immorality, there's a lack of religious practice, the clergy are ignorant, people are ignorant of the faith. If we could run this school, we could really change society. We could really change society, not in the sense that we want to transform civic society. We could inspire conversion. We could get people to be more Christian. And so Ignatius hears about this, and he thinks to himself, a school could be an agent of change, of conversion, of the reform, not of external institutions, but the reform of hearts. And they wanted us. They were willing to put up the money for us to found this school. Juan de Vega and the city magistrates in Messina are eager to have us. So there's an opportunity for us to do something we want to do to help souls. And we've got the means to do it. So Ignatius sends 10 men. 4 priests, 6 scholastics. He sends a real A team, including Hieronymo, Jerome, Nadal, Peter Canisius, Andre de Fru, and a man named Cornelius Wischhaben. The same guy that Faber wrote that letter to about confessions that I mentioned earlier. And he sends 6 scholastics, some of whom became very famous later within the society, Benedetto Palmio and Allevale de Coudray, others who did not perdure in the society. Happened then, happens now. He sends them, and most of these guys, they're very well-educated guys, and they were educated according to what's called the Parisian method, the method of education that they taught in Paris. And so they set up their school for boys according to the Parisian model. They use what they know, and they are wildly successful. This school takes off. The ministries associated with the Jesuits, all the normal things like hearing confessions and preaching and giving the exercises take off. Vocations take off. They soon want to found a novitiate in Messina. I mean, this is wildly successful, and all of these guys are so enthusiastic about how this is a place where God is at work and God is working through us, and there's great consolation and there's all these possibilities, and they're just brimming over with, this is a way that we can serve the church. This is a need that's not being met. And apparently we're good at running schools. Apparently we have the talent for this. And so as more requests come in to found schools, Ignatius starts saying, maybe this is where we should serve. Because we're good at it, because there's a need, and because this gives us a platform to help souls. That's the discernment that got us into education. The discernment that got us into, not into education, into educational institutions, into running schools, is that we felt the consolation present in the opportunity, the need, present in how it felt to do it, our own skill, our own ability, and present in the way that it impacted people, the way that we were not just educating people in grammar, teaching them to rhetoric, all these sorts of things that we do, all of worthwhile things, but that wasn't where the consolation was. The consolation was we're helping souls. We're bringing about conversion. We're bringing people closer to God. This allows us to do that. This gives us access to people and to society. We can transform people through doing this. That was the consolation that brought us into running educational institutions. And so as we face this question of where should we be today, I suggest that we should perhaps consider, well, if that's what we got into it, maybe we should ask the same 3 questions today. Where's the need? Where's the talent? And how can we best help souls? That's a discernment of where God is speaking to us that's perennial. And the answer is not necessarily obvious. The answer is not, oh, we're leaving every educational institution, or we should close everything else and just run schools, or anything like that. The question is not to determine exactly what we should do. The question is to have the openness that Ignatius and the early companions did to new possibilities, to the possibility of how God might be speaking to us. That's the invitation of communal discernment, is to listen for where God might be calling us that's beyond what we're doing right now, and to avoid in that the pitfalls of not knowing enough, falling for our comfort, but instead, like Fabre, to discern, oh, here's a place where I can do great good. Thank you.